So this month's video theme is Knitting SOS. We're going to be fixing knitting mistakes and solving knitting problems. And today I want to start by talking about troubleshooting knitting problems using online forums like, say, Ravelry. Now, I've learned an incredible amount over the years by participating in online knitting forums, mostly by helping other knitters. I've learned a lot of knitting techniques, and I've learned a lot about how knitters approach knitting that I wouldn't have learned on my own. So what I'm going to do is present a couple of knitting concerns that seem, at least superficially, to be related to each other. And I want you to see if you can visualize what this knitter's concern is. If you think there's any ambiguity in their problem, if you would like clarification for it, and what you might offer as a solution to their problem. Then what I'm going to do is point out the ambiguity in each of these concerns and give some demonstrations of what might possibly help in that specific situation. In the end, I think you'll see that the situations are very different from each other and not at all apparent on first glance. Then I'll come back and I'll give some tips for people who are looking for help in the online forums, for how to be clearer about what it is they're looking for, and also offer some tips for people who want to help other knitters in online forums and getting the clarity that they might need. So here's the first question. I've been knitting for many years and still occasionally have problems with my edge stitches getting too loose and big. What is the secret for tidy, consistent edge stitches? I end up with a big loop of yarn at the end of the row. Sometimes this might be stated as I end up with a big loop of yarn at the end of the first row after the cast on. My edges are loose and sloppy. I've tried knitting tightly at the start of the row, but it doesn't help. So on the surface, at least two of these statements seemed to be closely related, and the one about the big loop of yarn may or may not be related, might be something completely different. But you can see that there's some ambiguity in what they're asking. What is a big loop of yarn? What do they mean by edges? Are they talking about the first few stitches of a row and the last few stitches of a row? Or do they actually mean the selvage stitch, the actual last and first stitch of the row? It's not clear. So what is meant if someone says their edges are loose and sloppy? Well, what they could mean is that the first few stitches of the row are looser than the rest of the stitches. I have an example here of a linen top I'm working on. Linen has no elasticity, and I wasn't being terribly attentive to what was going on with my edges. But after a while, I noticed that the second stitch in every other row, not every row, every other row, was looser than the rest of the stitches. And so then I took some corrective action, and there's a slight difference in it still, but they're much better than they were, and this is likely to at least block out to some extent. So how do you address that problem of some of the first few stitches being larger than the rest of the stitches? Rather than trying to tighten up everything right away, you work. So in my case, the second stitch was larger, so I just worked the first two stitches as normal, and then I enter the third stitch, and at this point I give a little tug on the yarn to pull out any slack that might be here. If I try to pull out before that, I'm always going to be pulling the slack out of the previous stitches. So if what I want is to eliminate slack in the second stitch, I wait until after I've knit that, and then I enter the third stitch, and then I pull on the slack. So that can help with the size difference that you may find in some stitches close to the selvage stitch. So one problem that's more severe that people can have that can create a lot of excess slack at the end of a row, and not just, an enlarged stitch just inside, is if they have a tendency to pull their needles apart from each other in some way. One way might be by keeping the needles, pulling the needles apart as the stitch is being wrapped. Some people do that, and that and every time that happens, it pulls any slack out of the previous stitch, and it just keeps bringing more and more slack into the stitch that's currently being worked until it ends up all the way across the end of the needle. So that's one way. Another way is if after you've worked a few stitches and you're working further down the needles than you really should be, and you're pulling stitches off the needle like this instead of keeping the needles close together and just pushing the stitch off instead. As the stitch is being pushed off, you have a finger and thumb that can move these other stitches up toward the needle tip, so you never should be pulling stitches off the needle. You should be working close to the tips instead. So pulling stitches off or keeping stitches, pulling the needles apart while you're working the stitches can cause this excess slack to build up across the row. So by the time you end the row, you end up with this giant loop right here, and notice that this loop is under the needle. It's attached to the row under the needle. It is not the row on top of the needle. If you try to tighten that up by pulling on the working yarn, you are tightening the stitches that are on the needle. It does nothing to the stitch under the needle. So this is quite large, and this will just remain there. So if you have that habit of moving the needles away from each other as you're creating stitches, you can end up with very sloppy edge stitches. You can have a similar problem if you have cast on using the long tail cast on and you have a habit of completing a stitch and then pulling the needles apart like that. So when you're pulling the needles apart, it's pulling slack out in a different way, and it's only along this cast on edge that this is a problem, but you still end up with that big loop at the end. So you'll see as we get to the end, then we have this enormous loop left that will remain there. So if you use a slip knot to start with, and you're going to use the simple cast on, and that's when you're just looping the yarn around the needles so that it creates a twisted loop, but it's just a fancy way of wrapping the yarn around the needle. So if you're going to do that and use a slip knot, cast on, don't count the slip knot as a stitch. And let's say we want to cast on 5 stitches. So I've got 3, 4, so I've got 5 stitches right here, plus I have my slip knot. It's very difficult to control the tension across that first row when you use this type of cast on. So it's very easy to come, even if you're working hard to keep the needles close together, it is very hard to pull a little bit of slack out each time. It's just a very unstable edge, and it's like I've already got this much. I've only got 5 stitches on the needles. Imagine what it would be like with 100. I'm not pulling them apart very far. They're just so we end up with this loop, and if this was actually a stitch I had to knit, I'll show you what would happen. I would knit that, and then I'd have this loop right here. So instead, because that was actually an extra stitch, we can let the slip knot come off the needle, and then you can just pull out the knot, and then you just are left with the cast on edge. There's nothing wrong with the knitting technique in this method that produces that big loop. It's the combination of slip knot and the very difficult to control simple cast on method. So here are some tips for getting good help as quickly as possible in online forums. First, be as specific as you can with what your problem is. Are you getting holes in your work? How big are the holes? Like relative to what? How big are they compared to the stitches around them, for example? If you're having trouble with a particular pattern, please give us the exact pattern name and designer that you're working from. A lot of patterns have the same name or very similar names. And it's even more helpful if you can include a link to the Ravelry pattern page or a link to the website where you found the pattern if it's not on Ravelry. If you don't understand a set of instructions, if you're reading through your pattern and you come to a section and you just can't visualize what it is, and you're a visual learner, so you would really like to have a YouTube video, could somebody please point you to one? First, I want you to try actually following the directions with the yarn and needles in your hands. Often that will provide you the visualization that you need in order to work the instructions. When you're having trouble with particular row instructions, give us the entire instruction for the row and then tell us which part in particular isn't working for you. If you're having trouble with a particular row of instructions, you're ending up with the wrong number of stitches at the end of it, you need to tell us how many did you start with, how many you were supposed to end with, and how many you did end with. Then give us the entire row of instructions so that we can see where the potential problems might be. When you give us just the tiniest amount of information, we have nothing to go on. If you're trying to help somebody on the forums, think about the ambiguous language that might be in the request and see if there might be some clarification that you can get from the person needing help before you start brainstorming solutions. Just might save everybody a lot of time. Well, I hope you found this helpful. Next week, we're going to start fixing specific problems, so I hope you join me then. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.